Welcome to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs for another program from our San Francisco offices. Today we're going to talk to Fergus Bordewich again. He has been here several times, a series of books on the Civil War era, and this time we're talking about Centennial, his latest book. He talks about the Centennial Century exhibit in Philadelphia 100 years after. We just celebrated the 250th anniversary, so we're talking about 150 years ago, a very crucial year. And I thought what Fergus did really well was to use that as a context then for everything that was going on in that year that was having an effect, and it would have an effect on the future. So we'll go into that right away. But welcome back to the Commonwealth Club, Fergus, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, George. It's really a pleasure to be here again. And even though at this great electronic distance, I feel as if we're at least metaphorically in the same room.
Yeah, well, we are. And you brought me into the room by the nuance you brought to several issues. I thought I understood the Tilden Hayes election, but I missed a really big part of it. And you really added depth. We'll get into that a little bit later. But so tell us a little bit about the Centennial. It was Grant set it off with a speech which was not that memorable, but how it seemed like it was a really, really big cultural event. So let's talk about that.
It was. This is formally the Great Centennial Exhibition of 1876, known to absolutely everyone as simply the Centennial. People said to each other, what are you doing this summer? I'm going to the Centennial. How long are you going for? I'm going for 2 weeks because it'll take that long to see everything. Mm-hmm. It was a giant World's Fair, the first American World's Fair, first one in the Western Hemisphere as far as that goes. 20% of the American population went. That's 10 million people in the course of 6 months. It was in Philadelphia in Fairmount Park, which is a park roughly equivalent to New York Central Park. There were 200 buildings, many of them magnificent structures of iron and glass and steel, others wonderfully inventive neo-Gothic wood constructions. There were immense halls. The largest one was about 2,000 feet long and 500 feet in width. And there were several of approximately that size. Many states had their own pavilions. Many foreign countries had. It was the first time that foreign countries had ever exhibited in the United States, and the first time that many Americans had ever really encountered the art and the produce and the inventions and the industry of foreign countries, including notably both China and Japan. Almost no Americans really traveled in the 19th century, and virtually none traveled to East Asia. So it was both startling and thrilling for Americans to see all these things. The exhibits covered almost any kind of human work, from thousands of examples of American art. It was the first national exhibition of American art. It was quite diverse, really. There were many, many, many inventions. It really announced the United States as having arrived as a major industrial power in the world. That was already underway, but the Centennial Exhibition wowed foreign visitors, of whom there were many, many thousands. And some of these inventions are still with us today. One that I write about at some length is quite famous. Of course, it was the telephone being exhibited for the first time. And that ran the gamut from inventions of that type to things like soda water and ice cream, which probably were more interesting to many visitors in the steamy July and August heat of Philadelphia.
So you're saying that was the ranch dressing of its time. I mean, that everybody walked away from the World Cup coming back with ranch dressing on their minds from foreign things just now. So it's interesting that food is the thing that captures people the most of everything else that was there. But yeah, tell us a little bit about the Bell telephone exhibit, because he wasn't even sure it was going to work, and yeah, that was very interesting.
Yeah, I should say for context that Bell is one of four people I talk about as kind of anchors of this narrative story about the Centennial Exhibition and the year of 1876. Um, I chose Bell, one, because he would easily be recognized. We all think we know about the telephone, and we've all heard of Alexander Graham Bell. So but I wrote about him at length for a couple of reasons. One, the telephone truly was a stunning invention at the time. As you just said, Bell wasn't even sure he was going to go. He was a wonderful guy. His letters, I read his letters at the Library of Congress in Washington, and they're quite wonderful. They're very intimate and warm. He's writing to his parents, and he's writing to his fiancée, soon to become his wife. And he writes with a depth of emotion that's not very common in the 19th century. So you feel in his letters, you actually know the man. He's telling you how he feels about his inventions. He's telling you about his anxieties. And he wound up at the Centennial really only because he was more or less shanghaied onto a train by his fiancée, who pretty much pushed him on under false pretenses. And she had
Just the kind of
arranged.
wife you need, right?
She was very good. They were married. They remained married for, gosh, 50 years or thereabouts.
Yeah.
And she surreptitiously had his assistant put all his apparatus on the train, and Bell sends telegrams to her from the route. He stops when the train stops in New York and somewhere else, and says, "I want to go back to Boston." That's where his laboratory is. I want to go home. But at any rate, he wound up in Philadelphia, and he's full of anxiety. He doesn't think his apparatus is ready. The telephone isn't ripe enough. But it turns out to be a sensation. And I should say, it was noticed almost, you can't say by accident, but a bit haphazardly. It wasn't on exhibit every day. It was exhibited for judges. All the exhibits at the fair had judges. And they were taking a tour of industrial inventions on a particular day. And it was sweltering hot. The most prestigious guest at the Centennial, the Emperor of Brazil. Yes, that's emperor. Brazil had an emperor at that time, who was a very democratic sort of emperor, is in his shirt sleeves. Everybody, they all got sweat pouring off them. And the group of judges is ready to give up because of the weather, when the emperor notices Bell standing in the crowd looking at other inventions. And he says, "Mr. Bell, how wonderful to see you here." They had last met in Boston, when Bell was introducing him to something quite different. And he loved Bell. And he says, "Mr. Bell, do you have something here?" And he says, "Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I have this device." He says, "Well, let's go see it." And the emperor ensured that the judges went on to see and hear, of course, Bell's telephone, and they were astonished. The emperor, by the way, rather quaintly said, "Does it speak in Portuguese?"
Yeah. That's a great line.
Yeah.
And it did.
And indeed it did, because one of the emperor's assistants, I suppose, ran down to the other end of the line, way, way, way across the exhibition hall, and indeed spoke Portuguese through the phone.
Yeah. Great part of the story. And Bell's telephone really wasn't in place anywhere yet. I thought it was also interesting you gave the background of the experiments he had to do to get the right set of chemicals to make it work and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't just putting wires together.
No, it was extremely complex. When you read his letters, because they're very expressive, he was brilliant. I mean, that's not a shocker exactly, but he truly was brilliant. And he talks, often filled with anxiety and worry about whether this will work, whether that will work. But uh, he was driven. He was almost an artist. And one can say there is some commonality in different types of creativity. And you see that when or you learn that when you're reading Bell talking to himself, really, when he's writing. And by the way, another reason that Bell and his invention were particularly important was that in less than a year after the exhibition, this brand new world changing device was in commercial production.
Hmm.
So, talking about Bell and his telephone were a way of also talking about American capitalism and venture capital.
Hmm.
Was Bell succeeded in part uh, because he had money behind him, and he understood that it's one thing to have a great idea; it's another thing to get it to market. And he and the people surrounding him enabled him to do that, and that process epitomizes the turbocharged industrialism of 19th century America.
Yeah. And there had just been a financial panic a couple of years earlier, right? And there was still the effect of that, but it didn't seem to slow people down too much with their enthusiasm. What?
Well, yeah, that was the panic of 1873, which until the 1930s was referred to as the Great Depression. Uh, and and it was well remembered by people long afterward. And it continued for several years, and it was still New York. Sorry, the country was still in depression in 1876, and only very slowly recovering. But it's also true this is the golden age, gilded age. It is the gilded age of America, and the country was, in spite of being in a depression, growing wealthier. Industries were booming. Railroads were expanding. Steel production was expanding. Um, there was a lot of money in America, and for an entertaining rendering of it, I would recommend readers to Mark Twain's wonderful novel called The Gilded Age. He coined the term, uh, which is a caustic, satirical, and pretty compelling rendering of the intertwining of politics and big money in the era.
So one character, since you mentioned Mark Twain, one character, Walt Whitman, was disappointed by the centennial. Why don't you talk about that? Because that was very interesting. Little side digression in your book. I thought that was great.
Yeah, I initially had thought of writing about Whitman at length because he was living right across the river from Philadelphia in Camden, New Jersey, and he could actually hear the fireworks in his home being shot off at the centennial. And I thought, wow, I wonder what he had to say about it. And the annoying truth is, he didn't have anything to say about it. Uh, he didn't write about it. He visited it, but he didn't write about it.
Tried to get in
He
on
had
it, but didn't get invited, right? That all.
he intensely wanted, perhaps even desperately wanted, a poem of his to be selected as the Song of the Centennial. He wrote one specifically to compete for that award, and he didn't get it. So he was kind of miffed. Um, but even though he only, to my knowledge, only went to the Centennial once, uh, in my own writing about it, he kept kind of sneaking in under the door, you know, because uh, Whitman had so much to say about America, and he said it so well. And he wrote really about the American character in that era, his what he loved about America, and his fears for what Americans might be becoming: hollow people obsessed with money. Mm. And I quote him at length because he's, in a way, a counterpoint, a cautionary counterpoint to the sometimes bombastic celebratory rhetoric of the centennial.
Well, let's talk about one other person that was disappointed, General Custer.
Ha.
More than
Well,
disappointed. It was very interesting because you felt back in the time, the way you wrote it, that around July 4th, everyone was thinking, oh, Sitting Bull has been captured. And tell that story, because it's just, you can feel this whole big exhibit of saying how great America is going on, and then what happened, right? So,
yeah, well, you're right to put it that way. Custer was indeed disappointed. He wasn't disappointed by the centennial. He did go. He toured it. He spent some days there. He was particularly interested, I think, in the exhibits on American Indians, Native Americans. Um, but then he was hurried. He hurried back to the Dakotas to take part in a three-pronged attack on combined Sioux or Lakota and Cheyenne tribes, which had amassed, little did he know, the largest native army ever assembled in North America. And at the end of June 1876, his command was virtually wiped out in what's now Montana, the prairie. And I tell the story in the book, but the fact that this happened in the middle of the centennial year, at a time when Americans are wildly celebrating the first century, the greatness of the United States, America rising as a world power, and the imminent, or continuing, I should say, settling of the continent. You could go to the centennial and see the latest haul after haul of the latest agricultural equipment, which is soon going to be turning the prairies into farmland, the farmland that much of it is today. So on the day after, on July 5th, I believe, might have been the 4th, news reaches Philadelphia. This is more than a week after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, that not only has Custer been defeated, but the command is gone, that this happened to an American army. After story had reported to Americans that Custer was defeating Sitting Bull, maybe that he'd captured him. Quite the contrary, obviously. And it was a traumatic event for Americans. General William Tecumseh Sherman, who's the commander of the U.S. Army at the time, is visiting the Centennial also. And he's sitting in a hotel with his boots off and his feet up and his coat off because it's so hot. Probably fanning himself and having a beer. I don't know. When the news reaches him, and he says, it can't happen. It can't have happened. This is impossible. It must be wrong. Fake news. It wasn't. It
yeah,
was the truth. Yeah.
it reminds me of, what do you mean you closed the Strait of Hormuz? You can't do that. This is our year.
Yeah, George, I'm glad you mentioned that parallel, because if you hadn't, I would have.
Okay, good. All right. Well, let's talk about Edmonia Lewis. You sprinkled the story with her in a way which I just loved. But why don't we condense it and tell the story about Edmonia Lewis and what she accomplished? A very fascinating story.
It is indeed. Edmonia Lewis is probably my personal favorite character in this book. Okay, and she is one of the four people whom I highlighted and return to frequently in the course of the book. Now, I have to say that Edmonia Lewis is one of the most famous Americans almost nobody's ever heard of. Contradiction in terms, of course. She was a unique individual, a remarkable individual. Edmonia Lewis was a still young woman at this time. She was half African American and half Native American. Mostly she identified as African American, or simply she said Negro, which was the operative word, polite word at the time. And she had never been enslaved. She was from upstate New York, not far from the state capital, Albany, and she was a sculptor. She was the first Black American sculptor. And I should say, by the way, she was the first sculptor, male or female, white or black, to travel to the West Coast, including San Francisco and the Bay Area, to sell her sculpture. Um, uh, she, by 1876, was living in Rome in an art kind of amongst a community of female artists. But most of her sales were in the United States, and her ethnicity, of course, is an intense part of her identity because there was really nobody quite like her. She was very successful. She was probably among the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, Black American woman at the time. She had substantial assets from the sale of her sculpture. Her studio in Rome was visited by European royals, traveling wealthy Americans, and so on. She was educated. She was a graduate. Well, not a graduate. She'd attended Oberlin College, and as a very young woman, had been taught sculpture. I think beginning at Oberlin, but certainly in Boston when she's still in her 20s. And she worked in a neoclassical vein. That's not particularly to today's taste. Although you'll see plenty of it up at the Legion of Honor.
Right.
And her work wouldn't be out of place there, frankly. Mostly in her earlier decades, her sculptures focused on two themes: abolitionism and friends of abolition, and second, on Native Americans, specifically characters from the great Longfellow poem Hiawatha, which was known to everybody in America at a time when Americans read poetry for entertainment. Anyway, but her master, for the centennial, she sculpted a masterwork. She spent a couple of years on it, and it's titled "The Death of Cleopatra," which was a kind of popular theme in the 19th century. And Cleopatra was sometimes thought of as an African and therefore associated with Black Americans, although she didn't portray her figures as particularly African. But at any rate, this is a larger than life-size sculpture. It still exists. It's in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, and can be seen if anyone's traveling to DC. Yes. Well,
Sorry.
yeah, for now.
We hope it's
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. I assume that the popularity of Egyptian themes came from Napoleon rediscovering all that with his people when he took it over. I mean, that still was having an effect on the 19th century's art.
Yeah, yes, very, very much so. And many American artists rendered Egyptian themes, and there were other renderings of the death of Cleopatra. And I think there was even another one at the Centennial. But I want to add just about Edmonia Lewis. She was tiny. She was probably a bit under 5 feet tall. She dressed very picturesquely. And unlike most artists, she actually went to the Centennial. She stood there to introduce people to her sculpture. And you might imagine that most visitors, or many visitors, were shocked, stunned, flabbergasted to see this tiny Black woman there, the proud sculptor of what was regarded by many as one of the best pieces of art at the entire Centennial. And many people celebrated her. She was interviewed a lot, but she was mistreated occasionally by visitors who were appalled by the fact of an African American daring to claim public space like that.
Yeah. Let's transition from that into the politics of the time, because people were giving up on the goals of the Civil War, at least one of the goals of the Civil War. And you added a lot of context to what was happening. Even I thought that I was well read in this area, but you added a lot of depth. And basically, you said that in 1874, in the midterms, there was a lot of already people moving away from. I mean, it's famous that the Tilden and Hayes election and the fraudulent, or maybe not fraudulent, electoral college conclusion of it was the end of Reconstruction, the end of the attempt to move forward with the amendments that were in place, and that had changed society somewhat. And there were a lot of African American representatives in Congress and even in the Senate, and locally by state. All those things came to an end. The thing that I found fascinating was, I always thought, if the Republicans hadn't stolen this, then maybe Reconstruction could have stayed in place and we would have moved forward. But actually, the other party was even worse on the subject at the time. And I vaguely should have known that, but you made it perfectly clear that this compromise was maybe the best available thing at the time, which is very unfortunate to find out, but at least explains it, because it seems so incredible to me that 11 years after the Civil War, with all that death and destruction, that people just threw out what it was all for. Makes the war pretty useless.
Well, there's a lot. There's a lot to unravel there, George.
Yeah, sorry.
Um,
Well, you unraveled it very nicely in your book. So
Thank you. Let me start this way. Thanks for mentioning the year 1874. Almost nobody thinks of 1874 as really the pivotal year in the end of Reconstruction. So what happened in 74? As you said, it was the midterm elections. The Democratic Party won control of the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives controls the purse strings through the Ways and Means Committee. And they control public expenditures. So that put a full stop to President Grant's efforts to protect Black Americans in the South, and particularly to protect voting in the South and the two-party system in the South. There was a two-party system. Now, bear in mind that in the 1870s and 60s, the Republican Party of the time was the more progressive party. The Democratic Party harbored the country's reactionaries, okay? And increasingly, as the 1870s went on, it was the home to former Confederates who wanted to restore white supremacy in the South. And in addition, it contained people who were called dough faces in the North during the Civil War. That's Northerners who opposed the Civil War, often for racist reasons, not only, and so on. So the Democratic Party was ideologically and explicitly hostile to the rights of Native Americans, African Americans, and to the Reconstruction Amendments, and to the presence of federal troops in the South, and to the protection of voting rights in the South. Now, there's a myth that the South was under military occupation. It wasn't. There were fewer than 10,000 federal troops spread from Virginia to Texas over 11 states of the former Confederacy. That did not amount to an occupation. It meant a few soldiers here, posts of 10, 20, 30, 40, if at most, and having to cover often large areas in order to protect Black voters. Okay, so the Democrats in Congress after 74 refused to pay for that. They said, no, we will not pay for federal troops in the South anymore, much less the addition of more troops who might be necessary. And significantly, we will not pay for federal prosecutors to prosecute the Ku Klux Klan and whites in the South who commit crimes against Black and white Republican voters, many of which there were many examples. So that's kind of the context here. And I'm going to take issue with something you said, George, if you forgive me, which is to say, it's too often said that the 1876 election was a stolen election. There's no evidence for that at all. Um, was it controversial? It was very controversial. And Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, finally prevailed, but only by a single electoral vote. And that was after 3 months of political warfare over how to count the votes in 3 states. And it should be said, because this is important to understand, that had voting in the southern states been carried out freely, which it was not, Hayes would have prevailed by large numbers in the popular vote and therefore in the electoral vote. There's no question about it. It's not arguable. Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, the least charismatic candidate for president ever until Richard Nixon, probably, maybe surpassing Nixon. Tilden did prevail in the popular vote, but thanks to voter suppression in the South. And a special commission that was set up to try to make sense of what had happened in those three states. They happen to be Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Finally awarded the electoral votes in those 3 states to Hayes. That's where the controversy persists up to the present day. That was never done before, and it is, well, I would say it's never been done since, but our recent elections have sometimes been mired in controversy, as we all know. So I don't think the outcome was a theft at all. I think it was the correct outcome, but it was a very complicated and controversial election. It's not the same thing. But the outcome, so Hayes was an abolitionist. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. He was an abolitionist. He fought very bravely in the Civil War. He was wounded 7 times, twice very seriously, facing the enemy. He was personally, he felt deeply committed to the rights of African Americans, the Reconstruction Amendments, and so on. But the realities of politics of the time shackled him, as they had Grant, by the way. He couldn't act the way he wanted to act. Now, the last factor to stir into this pot that's very complicated is that the Northern public basically was done with the war. Northerners were tired of the South. They were tired of the South's problems. And sad to say, they were tired of the pleas of African Americans. And it's not hard to make sense of that. Racism ran deep in the North too. And that while there were still courageous radical Republicans in Congress, there were fewer and fewer, and they had less and less sway. So Hayes's own party had pretty much given up on the South by this point. So he didn't have grassroots support. So a lot of things went into the end of Reconstruction, from what happened in Congress in 1874 up to the loss of popular support for Reconstruction. I try to tell this story in the book in a compelling narrative way because it matters a lot. It was one of the watershed elections in American history, and it is a tragedy that Reconstruction was stopped in its tracks.
I want to pull in a point that you made in your earlier book that we discussed on Grant and the Ku Klux Klan, which was that you compared the Ku Klux Klan in its first iteration, that is, at that time, to a defeated army having a rear guard action against the winners. And I thought that was a great perspective to have on it. So anyway, we've discussed that before, but I just it makes it a lot clearer what the origin was, not what the second iteration and the next one and the next one was, but that one itself was much more like a defeated army that still wants to fight. So we've seen that happen in Iraq. We've seen that happen in Afghanistan. We kind of all know what that's like and why people do that. At least what's their main interest in doing it. Okay, so the politics of the time in what I know you're a historian, and historians don't like this kind of question, but do you apply anything from things happen in this time? It's very similar to things that are happening now because politics is often similar. And I think a lot of times when people look at problems like especially this Reconstruction problem, they assume that why didn't the people do what was right to do, and they don't pay attention to what the overall politics was, like you just said. There's no appetite for it. There's all kinds of things that we should do right now that we know would be good for us that we never get around to doing. So it's not dissimilar. It's just very unfortunate for the people who are the victims of whatever stupidity we're doing at the time.
Yeah, that's true. Look, I mean, this democracy is famously not an ideal system, but it's the best system we've got. And it depends in a large part on public will. And it would be naive. James Madison never even imagined that the general public would always want what was good and perfect. James Madison, more than any, and his colleagues, but Madison more than any, constructed the system we have, this what Patrick Henry called a crazy machine, but nonetheless constructed it to accommodate a great deal of conflict, dissent, sublimated violence, and so on. I mean, we should never imagine that the United States was free of political violence or that the system ever in any decade in American history operated free of controversy, conflict, and sometimes misrule. And there was, I hate to say it because I mean, I think this country would be very different in a very, very positive way had the federal government been able to continue to support African Americans in the South and carry Reconstruction through to its conclusion. It wouldn't have been peaceful. It would have still been very bloody because you had a lot of armed white supremacists in the South who were prepared to fight. It would have been bloodier had the federal government been able to stay in the South, protect elections, and protect African Americans and the two-party system in the South. But yes, I think it was the right thing to do in the same way that the Civil War, I think, was absolutely necessary, not inevitable, since nothing is ultimately inevitable. But I do think it was necessary to fight. And I don't think the outcome was squandered.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's perfectly true that African Americans in the South suffered a great deal. But slavery, let's step back. Slavery was not restored, which was what white supremacists in the South hoped to do. They couldn't accomplish it. The sharecropping economy was terribly discriminatory, but it wasn't slavery. And at the same time, during the same period, the dark decades of Jim Crow, a Black American middle class, for the first time in history, began to grow. African Americans became educated in very large numbers. There was nothing that formerly enslaved people wanted more than to be educated and to own a piece of property. And many, many, many thousands accomplished both. Not to the ideal that we would all wish to have seen, but it became the basis of the great turbocharged development of Black American society in the 20th century. We're getting into another area here. but I mean, the war was not a failure. It also, by the way, of course, reknit the United States into a strong nation, as opposed to a factious nation about to be pulled apart by states' rights. Okay, you'll never get rid of states' rights as an attitude of philosophy, but it suffered a catastrophic defeat in 1865. Um, so I think it's we shouldn't just look at the shortcomings or the failures, but but balance them with achievements that we may now take for granted.
Why don't we talk about Frederick Douglass and his role in the centennial then, as long as we're right here?
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, okay, Frederick Douglass was at the centennial.
Yeah.
He should have had a much bigger role at the centennial. He deserved it. There were people who advocated for him. Most notably, he was present at the opening of the centennial in May of 1876. Imagine this immense crowds, and a gigantic platform on which dignitaries, officials, office holders, President Grant, senators, congressmen, state officials, rich people, all kinds of people were present. Speeches were given, poems were read, songs were sung. Richard Wagner, the great German composer, composed a march for the centennial, and it was played. It wasn't very popular, by the way, but and Frederick Douglass was not invited to speak. Frederick Douglass was by far the best known, most respected African American public man in 1876, more so even than Black members of Congress and the Senate and state office holders. And now he was, in fact, initially turned away from entry to this huge platform. Most of those people weren't speaking; they were just sitting there. He was turned away by a guard, and fortunately, a U.S. senator, an abolitionist New York senator from New York State, Roscoe Conkling, famous today more for corruption than his abolitionism, but he was an abolitionist,
Mm-hmm.
a hardcore Republican radical. Said, "Mr. Douglass is with me. How can you turn away Mr. Douglass?" And Douglass wound up sitting there. I mean, Douglass was a realist. I mean, he struggled and coped with situations like this his entire life as a free person. He was unbowed because he'd been fighting this fight since the 1830s. But at any rate, so he was there, and you can't say he played a role because he wasn't really allowed to. But why wasn't he allowed to? I mean, here this is Philadelphia. The president of the centennial, that's to say the director, was a former Union general, and he was an abolitionist. President Grant is sitting there on the platform, and so on, and gives this small speech. Well, the centennial was crafted, and this took place over a couple of years. It was crafted as a major effort to facilitate reconciliation between the South and the North a decade after the Civil War, to bring North and South back together again. Reconciliation, typically at the expense of African Americans, was a major political force in the 1870s, gathering momentum year by year by year by year. And that is also, by the way, what I was talking about a little while ago when I explained that there is less and less Northern support for protecting the achievements of Reconstruction. So Mr. Douglass was perceived as being too controversial. It would have been a provocation to the South, to Southerners, whom the Centennial's organizers wanted to feel welcome. There were more controversies of this sort. It wasn't just over Douglas, over things that were exhibited, over certain statues that were present, over Edmonia Lewis, and things like this. Southerners uh, were at times apoplectic when they felt that they weren't getting adequately friendly treatment. They protested, for example, loudly that a statue that no painting of Robert E. Lee was set in a central position. This is Robert E. Lee, a traitor. He was the commander of an army who was trying to overthrow the United States government 10 years before. But it tells you how America, even in the North, has been evolving. So, I mean, Douglas's presence is more symbolic, but it is revealing of how the North is shifting, the treatment he received.
So for our live stream audience, if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat, and we will give them to Fergus in just a second. But first, there's a couple other big movements that also shows that people were not willing to tolerate something that was moving against the green at the time, which is the workers and also the women's rights people. So let's talk a little bit about, because people reacted quite violently to the workers, but officially, right? So,
well, okay. This is a big subject, and I'm going to try to be really concise in presenting. It's a challenge. Okay, there were virtually no labor unions in the United States in 1876. There had been a few feeble, failed attempts, but there were no labor movements. There was no labor unions and no labor movement. Organized labor didn't exist. So there were strikes in certain industries. They virtually all failed.
mm-hmm.
But what was happening, therefore, as you can sense, is that there was an upswell of demands arising from labor. And in 1876, at the time of the centennial, there is a brutal strike, a labor movement and strike, just 90 miles north of Philadelphia in the coal fields, Pennsylvania coal fields. And that strike has been broken. It's been broken, and many of its leaders, the workers are mostly Irish American at that time. And their leaders were known as so-called Molly Maguires, supposedly a secret organization that sought to overthrow business, capitalism, and the term communism as an epithet, as an attack word, first begins to appear in 1875, 76 in the United States. And it's thrown at these miners for striking. A dozen of their leaders are hanged during the same 6 months as the centennial is on. These are being reported in the same papers as people are reading about exhibits at the centennial. And these hangings were judicial lynchings.
Mm-hmm.
You could not imagine anything further from a fair trial. In a nutshell, because I got to tell you a little bit about these trials. The chief prosecutor up in Schuylkill County, where this was taking place, was also the head of the local coal company and the head of a railroad. And he invited himself to prosecute the men who'd struck in the county. And if you read, this is in the book, you read the language that he used, it is the most bloodthirsty kind of talk. They must die. None of them were guilty.
Mm-hmm.
They were lynchings. The next year, 77, I write about this in the book too, as part of the aftermath of the centennial, is the first national railway strike. Indeed, it's the first national strike in American history. Railroads were shut down from the East Coast as far as St. Louis. Um, Hundreds were killed, most particularly, but not only in Pittsburgh. So labor, as we come to know it as a powerful force in American life, is just beginning to feel its muscle right at this time, and it'll help shape what becomes America of the 20th century. And I should say a word, George, about the women, since you mentioned the women. On July 4th, at the centennial, July 4th was the biggest day of celebration, as you might imagine it would be. Speeches were given, bands played, concerts, and so on. There was another huge platform with public figures gathered to give speeches and so on. Um, five women. One of them, everybody's name now knows, Susan B. Anthony, with four associates, uh, were given seats on the platform. They had friends, they had allies who were men who wanted them there. But unexpectedly, they surprised the vice president after he had given a speech by dashing up to the front of the platform and handing him an enormous set of petitions and the Women's Declaration of Independence, one of the greatest feminist documents in American history. Um, it wasn't read at that moment, but it flabbergasted everyone. But Susan B. Anthony and her allies went across the square to another stage where they were joined by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, and it was read to the crowds. And it is one of the most radical documents that was ever introduced into American politics. Of course, it would take another nearly 50 years for women to achieve the vote, although Susan B. Anthony had in fact voted in Rochester, New York, and she was arrested for it. But she'd voted, and so had a few other women. Anyway, so not to be... Yeah.
I just love it that they rush the stage and then try to present their petitions. It's such an American thing to do.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have questions from the audience. So first one, during the research for your book, did you learn anything that shocked or surprised you?
Well, that's a good question. I can say quite a bit, which is to say, well, I was just talking about labor management issues, which I went into in my research very, very, very deeply. And I was, what should I say? Yes, surprised and deeply moved by the violence of the repression against working people, and the degree how repellent managed the authorities, including many people who were otherwise liberal. That's to say, some of the troops that are sent to militia sent to suppress the workers were also men who had fought in the Civil War on the Union side.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a fear of grassroots working people that's shocking and dismaying. I'd written a great deal about Reconstruction and violence in the South, and it was sometimes painful to revisit some of that in this book, Centennial. Something I'll mention one other thing because it was kind of a negative surprise. One thing that I really expected was that it was a year that would inspire deep soul searching among Americans. Who are we today after our first century? Who are Americans in 1876? Are we the people the founders imagined, or are we different? And who are we going to become in the future? And apart from Walt Whitman, who really was thinking in these terms, I was astonished at how little of that kind of trenchant self-analysis there was. It wasn't totally absent, but I mean, look, I guess people certainly had a right to celebrate that first 100 years, and to take pride in it and how much the country had accomplished. So, and that was very well expressed at the centennial. But it wasn't terribly reflective.
All right. Next question. You mentioned the challenges of the centennial activities. Can you talk about the positive outcomes that came from the celebration?
Mm. Sure. Well, to be brief, as I may have said at the beginning, the centennial really put the United States on the world stage as a power. Nobody, nobody had any doubts that the United States was a great rising power because of the industrial might that they witnessed. Their American industries exhibited thousands and thousands, both inventions and um, industrial products, and also, I would say, consumer products of a sophistication, often a beauty and innovativeness that astonished the world. It was often written about, not just by Americans, but by foreign visitors to the centennial. So the world began, and Americans begin to see the America, the kind of powerful industrial nation and consumerist society, for better and worse,
Mhm.
that we became by the 20th century. It was already there in the 19th. So there's that. There are specific inventions. There's the telephone and various other ones. Many of them less famous, or innovations of already existing machinery and so forth. Uh, and again, America will be seen as already after 1876 as is seen as surpassing Europe in its innovativeness. Um, uh, the department store. Americans had never seen a department store, with I think two exceptions before 1876, unless you were living in downtown Manhattan or very recently in downtown Philadelphia. You never saw a department store. You never saw the panoply of consumer goods that people saw at the centennial, and afterward. Department stores expanded everywhere. Let's leave it at that. There were a lot of things.
Yeah. Okay, great. Then let's have one big question for you. Since you said that the Americans, other than Walt Whitman, were not that reflective about, are we the Americans that were expected by the founders, and did we do what it is? So now we're in our 250th anniversary. Are we the Americans that the founders expected now? Do you think that there's been much self-reflection this year?
Well, George, that is a big and a serious question. Okay. I've written a couple of books about the founding era.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
the first Congress, and a different book about the 1790s, and I'm currently writing a book about the 1780s,
Yeah.
in the years leading up to the Constitutional Convention, when the founders are trying to wrestle this menagerie of little states, contentious states, into a nation. Okay. Um, uh, Today, you know, if if people really did spin in their graves, George Washington would be going at 50 miles an hour. So, uh, the present occupant of the White House is what the founders feared most in an executive. They talked about it. Uh, well, they used the term monarchy, okay, because that's what they knew from the British colonial period. And what we're seeing is an individual, the first ever in American history, with aspirations to act like a monarch. We're also seeing uh, very disturbingly, a pretty much supine Congress, We have a situation where one party dominates all three branches of the government. And we all learned in junior high school that the three branches of the government are supposed to essentially balance each other, and that is not happening today. The executive has been growing more and more powerful through most of the 20th century, not in the 19th century. Madison said, and American presidents, with only a couple of exceptions, right into the 20th century, regarded the Congress as the primary engine of government and the most powerful branch of government, not the executive, not the president. So we're in new territory here as far as the imbalance is concerned. And I think all the founders who worried about a runaway executive would be deeply troubled. And they ran a gamut of people, the founders. They weren't all of one mind. I mean, we can't help but be troubled. And even people who may have voted for the present occupant of the White House ought to be troubled at the collapsing of legislative power in the United States, because it's setting terrible precedents for the future. And but okay, I don't want to end on a terribly. Go ahead.
So, do you think that the current situation is going to remind everybody of why we don't want that kind of a leader? Because who wants to be at the whim of just one individual? And we'll say we need to revitalize the Congress. We need to do this and do this. Do you think that is going to be the result of these years, or do you think that it will be so popular that people will be looking for new iterations of exactly the same thing?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it, George?
Yeah. Be optimistic.
Okay. Okay. On balance, I think if one is a real Democrat, I mean it in the sense of small d.
Yeah.
You have to believe in the people.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You have to believe that the people ultimately, they may stumble, they may make, even in the name of popular government, some terrible decisions, and there are more than a few in our history. But that, if you don't believe in the people, you're not really a Democrat. You don't really believe in the system and these institutions, which, with faults that anybody can point out, nonetheless have been incredibly flexible over 250 years. May not seem that way, but they have been.
Yeah.
So on balance, I think that we, collectively speaking, I'm talking about American voters. I mean, the worst thing people can do is to give up on the country, is to give up on the ballot box, and to give up on politicians. Politicians are as capable of creativity as any other people.
Mm-hmm.
And there is such a thing as creative politics, and we've seen it innumerable times in our history. And that creativity may come from people who seem on the outside to be kind of bland, paunchy, middle-aged guys, speaking as a paunchy, well, I'm beyond middle-aged. But I'm talking to you from Washington today, by the way, and I'm looking out my window, and the U.S. Capitol dome is just up the hill from me.
Uh-huh.
So, that said, yeah, there's a caveat here. It is frightening, justifiably frightening, that tens of millions of Americans do seem to be kind of okay with a more dictatorial system.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who seem to be shrugging those dictatorial tendencies off. I mean, that's something we need to worry about, and needs to be addressed, and the way to address it is through politics. And those who oppose that need to be more creative than they've been, and they need to be, frankly, often tougher than they've been. And there are people, I'm speaking also of people in both parties, frankly, because there are plenty in the president's party who know that this is an appalling situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to wrap it up, it does seem to me that even though there are tens of millions who are appreciative of some of the things that have been accomplished, there is also a dismay when it doesn't go the way that they were expecting, and therefore it doesn't look quite as good as it did before. And there's been a lot of successes, and that's why it remains popular. The successes may not be ones you agree with, and that's a different part of the population. But if it's successes in what you agree with, then you're happy. And if it's failures in what you agree with, then you're not happy. And I think anybody that's in office long enough, ends up on the on the negative side, because it's hard to keep up those successes.
Yeah, I mean, politics is a rough business. It is absurd to expect some kind of perfection in it, because that doesn't exist. It's not a big group hug up there on Capitol Hill, and it never has been. It's sublimated conflict, and most politics is ultimately disappointing. This isn't breaking news. Founders, the founders felt that way. Henry Clay felt that way in the 1850s. Uh, I mean, FDR felt that way, and so on.
The crucial institutional thing would be to design it in a way that narcissists need not apply. And that would change politics, because it's not just a couple.
Well, I would say idealists incapable of compromise need not apply.
Also. Anyway, that was a great conversation. Thank you very much, Fergus, for another good book. Looking forward to the one about the 1780s.
Well, thank you, George. Always a pleasure. And thank you for your great questions.
And thank you, audience, for joining us for another great conversation about history at the Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. We'll see you again.